Fated to the Vampire King. Written by Pen. Narrated by Serena Williams. Chapter 1. Sophia kicked a stray soda can down the sidewalk, her steps echoing in the quiet night. Her bag felt heavier with each step, and her mind replayed the conversation with her boss. She muttered to herself, "Sure, Sophia, stay late to finish the stupid report. Don't worry about walking home in the middle of the night like a character in a horror movie. Smart choice." The street lights flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement. She shivered and quickened her pace, her hand clutching her bag strap like it was a weapon. "Okay, if anyone jumps out, I'll just hit them with a stapler." "Yeah, great plan." She turned the corner and froze. A tall man stood under the flickering light, his posture unnaturally still. He wore a dark coat that blended into the shadows, and his face was a mixture of sharp angles and quiet intensity. His eyes locked on hers like he'd been waiting for her. Sophia's stomach dropped, but she forced a smile. Hey, if this is the part where you tell me I dropped my wallet, I didn't." He took a step forward, his voice low and commanding. "You're mine." Sophia blinked. "What?" "You're mine," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She squinted at him, her brain scrambling to make sense of the situation. "Okay, you've clearly mistaken me for someone else. Or maybe this is a really bad pickup line." She tilted her head. "Look, I don't have time for whatever this is." Before she could turn to leave, he was in front of her, like really fast. She stumbled back. "Whoa, how did you? Are you a magician?" He didn't answer, just reached out and gripped her arm gently but firmly. Sophia twisted and yanked. "Hey, let go. I don't care how tall you are. I can scream really loud." "You're coming with me," he said simply. "Excuse me? I think not." She flailed wildly, her bag hitting his chest with an unimpressive thud. "Stop struggling," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Then, without another word, he scooped her up like she weighed nothing. Sophia gasped. "What the? Put me down. What is this, an abduction? Are you a weirdo? A cult leader? Oh no, this is about those pyramid schemes, isn't it?" He ignored her, walking with swift, deliberate strides into the darkness. Sophia had no idea how long he carried her or how far they went. By the time they stopped, she was too busy mentally cursing herself for skipping gym class in high school to notice where they were. When she finally looked up, her jaw dropped. They stood in front of the creepiest house she'd ever seen. Tall stone walls loomed above them, with towers that looked like they belonged in an old vampire movie. The windows glowed faintly, flickering as if lit by candles. "Wow," she muttered. "Nice, castle. Very on brand. For kidnappers. Do you have secret passageways too? Or is that extra?" He didn't respond, just carried her inside. The interior was just as dramatic as the outside. Dim lighting, antique furniture, and walls lined with old books. Sophia glanced around, trying to process the sheer ridiculousness of it all. "Right," she said aloud. "This is totally normal. Totally fine. I get kidnapped, and it turns out my abductor is—" "What?" "A haunted librarian." He set her down on a couch, finally releasing her wrist. She immediately jumped to her feet. "Okay, buddy, listen," she started, pointing a finger at him. "I don't know what your deal is, but this whole creepy mansion thing, not working for me. So, if you could just point me to the exit." "You're not leaving," he said, cutting her off. Sophia blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" He stepped closer, his intense gaze pinning her in place. "You're mine." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, unable to stop herself, she let out a laugh. "Okay, sure. And I'm Beyonce. Now, seriously, what's going on here? Is this some prank? Did my boss put you up to this?" He frowned, clearly unamused. "This is not a joke. You're my mate." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "You're what?" "My mate," he repeated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She squinted at him, trying to figure out if he was crazy, dangerous, or both. Look, dude, I think you've got the wrong person. I'm not anyone's mate. I'm just a regular person with a boring job, and you're mine, he said again, his tone firm. Sophia sighed. Yeah, you keep saying that, but it doesn't make it true. Do you have a name, or should I just call you Mr. Cryptic? He hesitated for a moment, then said, Cassian. Well, Cassian, she said, crossing her arms. This has been a delightful introduction, but I'd like to go home now. So if you could just— You're not leaving, he interrupted. Sophia threw her hands up. Of course I'm not. Why would I? Being kidnapped and dragged into a spooky mansion is exactly how I wanted to spend my evening. When Cassian left the room, Sophia immediately started looking for a way out. Her hands were tied. Not tightly, but enough to slow her down. She sat on the floor and started chewing at the ropes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all she had. The door opened and Cassian stepped back in. He stopped when he saw her, his eyebrow arching. What are you doing? Sophia froze, the rope still in her mouth. Then, without missing a beat, she mumbled, What? I'm hungry. For a second, he just stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he let out a low chuckle. You're persistent, he said, walking over to her. Thanks, she replied, spitting the rope out. I try. He knelt down and untied her wrists, his movements careful and deliberate. Don't try to run, he warned, his voice calm but firm. Sophia tilted her head, pretending to consider it. Run? Why would I leave this lovely, place? She gestured vaguely at the dusty furniture. Cassian didn't respond, but there was a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, like he was holding back a smile. Chapter 2. Sophia woke up to the faint sound of birds chirping. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The soft bed, the heavy curtains, the quiet room, it was all so unfamiliar. Then the memories of last night hit her like a slap. Right, she muttered, sitting up. Kidnapped by Captain Broody Pants. Fantastic. She glanced around, spotting her shoes neatly placed by the door. Weird. The kidnapper had manners, but she wasn't going to stick around to figure him out. She didn't know who this guy was, why he'd kidnapped her, or what his whole "your mind" spiel was about. She tiptoed to the door, testing the handle. To her surprise, it turned easily. Ha, she whispered. Not much of a jailer, are you? The hallway was eerily quiet. Sophia crept along, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She glanced at the dramatic paintings on the walls and shook her head. Creepy house, creepy guy, she whispered. This is exactly how horror movies start. Except I'm not the girl who trips. Nope, not me. She reached the front door, the large iron handles cold against her hands. As quietly as possible, she pushed it open. The morning air hit her face, cool and fresh. For a second, she considered just running blindly, but she stopped herself. Plan first, run second, she whispered. Be smart, Sophia. She scanned the surroundings. The mansion sat at the edge of a dense forest, the trees towering and dark. It looked like the kind of place where bad things lurked. Great, she thought. But bad things in the forest are still better than staying here. Sophia had been running for what felt like forever. Her legs ached, her breath came in short gasps, and the forest around her grew darker the deeper she went. Okay, she muttered between breaths. Bad idea. Super bad idea. Good job, Sophia. She paused, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. That's when she heard it. A low, guttural growl. Her head snapped up, her heart pounding. From the shadows, yellow eyes stared back at her. Oh, she whispered, backing away slowly. Nice, whatever you are. I'm not tasty. I promise. The creature stepped closer, its large body covered in fur, and its teeth sharp enough to send a chill down her spine. Sophia's hands trembled as she looked around for anything she could use to defend herself. A stick, a rock, anything. But before she could act, a voice called out behind her. Stop. Sophia turned to see Cassian standing just a few feet away, his face calm but his eyes burning with something she didn't understand. The creature growled again, but took a step back. Another followed, its yellow eyes flicking nervously between Sophia and Cassian. Then, without a sound, both creatures turned and bolted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. Sophia blinked, her chest heaving. What was that? Cassian stepped closer, his dark coat billowing slightly in the wind. They won't harm you, he said simply, as if that explained everything. Sophia glared at him. Yeah, I noticed. They practically ran the second they saw you. What are you, some kind of animal whisperer? He didn't answer, just gestured for her to follow him. Back at the mansion, Cassian led Sophia to the study. She didn't bother sitting down this time. All right, she said, crossing her arms. You clearly have some weird magic animal control powers, and I think it's time you start explaining. Who are you? What are you? Cassian looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. I'm not human, he said simply. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I kind of figured that out when you kidnapped me and scared off the forest monsters. But what are you? A wizard? A demon? Some weird guy who drinks kale smoothies? His lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile, but he didn't. I'm a vampire. Sophia froze. A vampire. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh and tell her it was a joke. But he didn't. Oh, sure. Of course. Why not? This just keeps getting better. Cassian ignored her sarcasm and continued. I kidnapped you because you're my mate. There it is again, she said, throwing her hands in the air. That word, mate, what does that even mean? Am I supposed to know? It means, Cassian said, his tone calm but firm, you are destined for me. You are the one person in the world who can complete me, who can make me stronger. Sophia blinked at him. Right. So I'm some kind of vampire accessory? Is that it? No, he said, stepping closer. You're more than that. Much more. You're important, Sophia. Not just to me, but to the world. Sophia frowned, backing up a step. What are you talking about? Cassian hesitated, as if debating how much to tell her. Finally, he said, You have power, Sophia. A rare, unique power that hasn't been seen in centuries. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Power? Me? Buddy, I can barely get my Wi-Fi to work. I think you've got the wrong person. You don't know yet, he said, his voice soft. But you will. Soon. Sophia shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. You know what? No, I don't care what kind of vampire destiny nonsense you're talking about. I don't want any of this. I just want to go home. You can't, Cassian said, his tone firm. If you leave, they'll find you. Who? She demanded. The creatures you saw in the forest. And worse. Sophia's stomach twisted at the memory of those yellow eyes. Why me? Why do they care about me? Because of what you are, Cassian said. And because of what you mean to me. Sophia let out a hollow laugh, her voice shaking. Great. So I'm just bait? That's what you're saying? You're not bait, Cassian said, his voice sharp. You're mine, and I'll protect you with everything I have. Sophia sat down hard in the chair, her mind racing. None of this made sense. Vampires, powers, destiny. It was like something out of a bad movie. But the way Cassian spoke, the way he looked at her, it felt real. Too real. Fine, she said finally. I'll stay. For now. But only because I don't want to get eaten by whatever those things were, and I hate my boss. Cassian nodded, relief flashing across his face. You made the right choice. Don't get used to it, she muttered. As she sat there, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders, She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was never going to be the same. Chapter 3. Sophia was sitting on the couch in the library, pretending to read one of the many ancient books Cassian had stocked. Truthfully, she wasn't reading. Her mind kept going back to the events of the last couple of days. Monsters in the forest, a vampire claiming she was his mate, the whole fate thing that still made her roll her eyes every time she thought about it. She sighed, closing the book with a thud. She'd agreed to stay because, well, she didn't want to get eaten. But this whole setup felt surreal. Was he just going to keep her here forever? What was she supposed to do all day? Read about dusty vampire history. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint smell of smoke. Sophia sniffed the air, her brows furrowing. Was something burning? The smell grew stronger, and she bolted up from the couch. Oh, great, she muttered. First a creepy mansion, now a fire hazard. She followed the smell down the hall until she reached the kitchen. Her eyes widened at the scene in front of her. Cassian stood by the stove, holding a pan that was very much on fire. Black smoke billowed up toward the ceiling. His normally calm, stoic expression was slightly panicked as he reached for a towel, trying to fan the flames. "What are you doing?" Sophia yelled, rushing into the kitchen. Cassian turned to her, his face a mix of embarrassment and determination. "I'm cooking." Sophia froze. Then she burst out laughing, doubling over as tears pricked her eyes. "You're what? Oh, my God. Is this your idea of cooking? Are you trying to summon a demon with all this smoke?" Cassian frowned, clearly unamused by her reaction. "I'm trying to make dinner for you." That made her laugh even harder. She clutched her stomach, gasping for air. "Dinner? Cassian, this isn't dinner. This is an exorcism." He growled softly, his frustration growing. "I don't see what's so amusing." Sophia wiped a tear from her cheek, still giggling. "You almost set your entire kitchen on fire, and you don't see what's amusing? Oh, this is rich." Cassian's jaw tightened, but instead of snapping at her, he turned back to the stove. He turned off the burner, grabbed the pan, and dumped its charred contents into the sink. Sophia leaned against the counter, watching him with a smirk. "All right, chef, what exactly were you trying to make? Burn offerings?" He shot her a glare. "Steak." Sophia blinked, then snorted. "Steak? That was steak. Cassian, that thing was so black it could have been used as charcoal." Cassian ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I wanted to impress you," he admitted, his voice lower now. Sophia's teasing grin faded slightly. She tilted her head, studying him. "You wanted to impress me?" He met her gaze, his dark eyes intense. "Yes, you've made it clear you don't trust me. I thought this might help." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Well," she said finally, crossing her arms, "burning your kitchen down probably isn't the best way to do that." Cassian's lips twitched like he was fighting a smile. "Noted." "All right, move," Sophia said, stepping closer and nudging him away from the stove. "You clearly have no idea what you're doing." Cassian raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside, watching as she grabbed a fresh pan and inspected the remaining ingredients on the counter. "First of all," she said, holding up a bottle of oil, "you don't just dump half a gallon of this into the pan. That's how you start a fire." Cassian leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Is that so?" Sophia glanced at him, her lips quirking up. "Yes, that's so. Haven't you ever watched a cooking show or something?" "No," he said simply. Sophia rolled her eyes. "Of course not. Vampires are too busy brooding in dark corners to learn basic life skills." Cassian smirked, his gaze never leaving her. "Perhaps, but I've lived long enough to know I don't need to cook for myself." Sophia turned back to the stove, her cheeks heating slightly under his intense stare. She cleared her throat, focusing on the task at hand. As Sophia worked, Cassian stayed close, handing her ingredients and watching her every move. "So," she said, flipping a piece of meat in the pan, "how old are you anyway? 200? 300? Older," he replied. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Older? What, like 500? Older." Sophia paused, raising an eyebrow. "Okay, now you're just being vague to sound mysterious." Cassian chuckled softly. "You seem to enjoy teasing me." She smirked. "It's a hobby. You make it easy." He stepped closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small kitchen. "Careful, Sophia," he said, his voice low. "I might start teasing back." Sophia's breath caught, and she quickly turned back to the stove, focusing on the food. "Yeah, well, good luck with that." When the food was finally done, Sophia plated 2 servings and set them on the table. It wasn't anything fancy, just simple, perfectly cooked steak with roasted vegetables. She sat down and gestured for Cassian to do the same. "All right, Mr. Vampire, let's see if you can handle human food." Cassian raised an eyebrow but picked up a fork and knife. He cut into the steak and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "Well," Sophia asked, watching him expectantly. "It's adequate," he said, though there was a hint of amusement in his tone. Sophia laughed. "Adequate? Wow, don't overwhelm me with your compliments." Cassian's gaze softened as he watched her laugh. "You're beautiful when you smile," he said quietly. Sophia froze, her laughter fading. She looked at him, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, thanks, I guess." The mood in the room shifted, the air growing heavier. Cassian set his utensils down and leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm only telling the truth." Sophia swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. His hand rested on the table, fingers just inches from hers. "You're important to me, Sophia," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "More than you realize." Sophia's heart raced, her breath hitching. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Cassian leaned in closer, his eyes flicking down to her lips. The space between them felt impossibly small, the tension crackling like electricity. For a moment, Sophia thought he was going to kiss her. Part of her wanted to pull away, but another part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed, froze in anticipation. But just as his lips were about to brush hers, Cassian stopped. He pulled back abruptly, his jaw clenching. "Forgive me," he muttered, standing up quickly. Sophia blinked, the spell breaking. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. Yeah, sure. Forgiven," she said, though her voice sounded shakier than she wanted. Sophia retreated to her room that night, flopping onto the bed with a groan. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. "What the heck was that?" she whispered to herself. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it didn't matter. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Cassian had looked at her, the intensity in his eyes, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he almost kissed her. Meanwhile, Cassian stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates on the table. His hands curled into fists, frustration and longing swirling inside him. "She'll understand," he whispered to the empty room. "She has to." Chapter 4. After staying with Cassian for weeks and seeing no sign of attacks, Sophia decided it was all a bluff. He had probably scared her with the whole monsters will get you thing just so she wouldn't escape. Well, it worked until now. She sat on the edge of her bed, frowning at her reflection in the ornate mirror across the room. She had been a prisoner long enough. No one was coming to save her, and Cassian's strange, possessive behavior wasn't about to change. "This is stupid," she muttered to herself. "I'm not some damsel in distress waiting for a rescue. I'll rescue myself." Her plan started with weapons. If she was going to sneak out, she needed to be prepared for whatever might lurk in the shadows. Sophia crept down the hall toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets until she found a few cloves of garlic. She held one up, squinting at it. This works on vampires, right? Or is that just for seasoning spaghetti? She stuffed the garlic into her pocket and continued searching. In one of the dusty, unused rooms, she found an ornate vial of what she assumed was holy water. It sat on a shelf next to a bunch of religious trinkets. She grabbed it, muttering, "If this isn't holy water, it's about to be a very awkward moment." Finally, she grabbed a wobbly chair from the corner and yanked one of the legs off, creating a rough, jagged steak. She tested its weight in her hand. Perfect, totally intimidating. Late that night, when the castle was quiet and still, Sophia made her move. She slipped out of her room, clutching her makeshift steak in one hand and the garlic in the other. The holy water was stuffed in her pocket, jangling softly with every step. As she tiptoed through the halls, every creak of the floorboards made her jump. The dim candlelight flickering along the walls only made the shadows look more sinister. "Why does this place have to be so creepy?" she whispered. "Would it kill them to install some modern lighting? Or a cleaning service? This dust is ridiculous." Finally, she made it to the courtyard. The open gate ahead seemed like a beacon of freedom, and her heart pounded with excitement. She was almost there. But just as she stepped into the open, a shadow moved in front of her. Sophia froze, clutching her weapons tighter. Out of the shadows stepped Cassian, his tall figure looming and his dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with danger. Sophia stumbled back, holding up the garlic like it was a shield. "Stay back. I have this." Cassian stopped, tilting his head as he examined the garlic in her hand. "Garlic," he said, his tone flat. "Really? It works in the movies," she snapped. He took a step closer, his movements deliberate and slow. "Sophia, you're going to hurt yourself with that steak before you hurt me." She growled in frustration and tried to dart around him, but he was too fast. Before she knew it, his hand caught her wrist, and he spun her around, gently but firmly pressing her back against the nearest wall. Cassian caged her in, his hands braced on either side of her head as he leaned in. His dark eyes bored into hers, and his voice dropped to a low murmur. "Running won't help you, Sophia." Her pulse raced, but not from fear. His proximity was overwhelming, his intense gaze making her stomach flip in a way she didn't want to admit. "If you're going to bite me," she muttered, trying to sound defiant, "at least brush your teeth first." For a moment, Cassian stared at her, stunned. Then, to her shock, he let out a low chuckle. "You're ridiculous." Cassian's amusement faded quickly, replaced by something darker. His gaze softened, but the intensity remained. His face was inches from hers, and Sophia couldn't move, pinned by both his body and the weight of his stare. "You're mine, Sophia," he said, his voice like a growl. "Do you understand that? You can run, you can fight, but you'll always belong to me." Sophia swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She hated the way his words made her feel, like part of her wanted to believe him. "Yeah, well," she muttered, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Maybe I don't want to belong to anyone." Cassian leaned in even closer, his lips almost brushing her ear as he whispered, "It doesn't matter what you want. Fate decided this, not me." Cassian finally pulled back, his intense gaze softening slightly. His tone became quieter, almost gentle. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is out there? If something happened to you—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening, as if he couldn't bear to finish the thought. Sophia blinked, thrown off by the raw emotion in his voice. "I didn't ask you to care," she said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. He stepped back, but didn't let go of her completely. His hand lingered on her wrist, his thumb brushing her skin. "I'll always care," he said firmly, "whether you like it or not." Before she could respond, he reached for the steak in her hand. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, his touch lingering a moment too long. "This is poorly made," he said, examining the jagged edge. "You'd need a sharper point to kill me." Sophia scowled. "Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly planning to kill you. Just scare you a little." Cassian smirked, his dark eyes gleaming. "Good luck with that." Cassian led Sophia back to her room, ignoring her protests. When they arrived, he opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. "You're not leaving this castle," he said firmly. "If you try again, I'll have to keep you closer." Sophia raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Closer? What? Are you going to tie me to you?" Cassian leaned down slightly, his voice low and threatening. "If that's what it takes to keep you safe, yes." Sophia glared at him as he stepped back and closed the door behind her. She paced the room angrily, muttering to herself about his arrogance and overprotectiveness. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her frustration, she couldn't shake the memory of his intense gaze or the way her heart raced when he was close. Meanwhile, outside her door, Cassian stood guard, his expression unreadable. He knew Sophia hated him now, but he didn't care. All that mattered was keeping her safe, even if it meant protecting her from herself. Chapter 5. Sophia was bored. Not just regular bored, but the kind of bored that made her start counting the cracks in the stone walls of her room. She had tried reading, pacing, even rearranging the pillows on the bed, but nothing worked. Weeks in the castle were wearing her down. Her curiosity got the better of her. When she noticed the guards outside her room had wandered off, distracted by some commotion down the hall. This was her chance to explore, and maybe, just maybe, find something interesting enough to break the monotony. Quietly, she slipped out of her room, her bare feet padding softly against the cold floor. Sophia's wandering led her to a part of the castle she hadn't seen before. It was darker here, quieter, with an almost eerie stillness. She turned a corner and stopped in front of a slightly open door. A flickering light from inside suggested someone had recently been there. Curiosity tugged at her, and she pushed the door open wider. It was a study, filled with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines worn and ancient. Trinkets and artifacts were scattered on the desks and shelves, strange objects she didn't dare touch. Her eyes landed on an old leather-bound journal lying open on the desk. "It's not snooping if it's out in the open, right?" she whispered to herself. Before she could second-guess her decision, she picked it up. The first few pages were written in a neat, flowing script. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Cassian's. The entries started innocently enough. Musings about the state of his kingdom, notes about strategies and treaties. But as she flipped further, the tone changed. One entry described a failed peace meeting decades ago. Cassian's parents had attended, hoping to broker an alliance with a neighboring wolf pack. Instead, they were ambushed and killed. The betrayal had sparked a war that had lasted years. Sophia's throat tightened as she read. Another entry revealed Cassian's guilt. He wrote about the lives he had taken in the name of vengeance, calling himself a monster who couldn't stop. Her fingers brushed the pages as she turned them, the words drawing her in deeper. "So, he's not just the big bad vampire king," she murmured. "He's also got issues." The sound of the door creaking open made her jump. She froze, her heart pounding, as Cassian stepped into the room. His expression was unreadable, but his dark eyes flicked to the journal in her hands. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Sophia's grip tightened on the journal. "I mean, if you didn't want anyone to read it, maybe don't leave it out like a vampire diary waiting to be opened." Cassian stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." Sophia laughed nervously, taking a step back. "It's not like I planned this." The door was open. "What, were you hoping I'd trip over your tragic backstory?" Cassian sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure cracking just slightly. Instead of scolding her, he moved to the desk and sat down, his shoulders tense. "You're the first person I've let into my life in centuries," he admitted quietly. Sophia blinked, surprised. "Oh, okay. That's not what I expected you to say." He rested his hands on the desk, his fingers brushing against the edge of the journal. "I've ruled for centuries, Sophia. But it's not ruling. It's surviving. Alone." Sophia felt a pang of something she didn't want to name. Sympathy? Pity? Whatever it was, she didn't like it. "Wow," she said after a moment, trying to lighten the mood. "You're not just broody. You're super broody. I didn't sign up for an emotional vampire therapy session." Cassian let out a low chuckle, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You're insufferable." "You're welcome," she quipped, but her smile faltered when their eyes met. For the first time, she saw something vulnerable in his gaze. It made her chest tighten in a way that annoyed her. She didn't want to feel sorry for him, not when he was the one keeping her here. Cassian stood and moved closer, his towering presence making her feel small, but not in a bad way. His voice softened, becoming almost intimate. "You're the first person who's made me feel something. I don't know what it is, but I can't lose it now." Sophia's breath hitched. I didn't ask for any of this." He stepped even closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I don't care. You're mine, Sophia." That hasn't changed. Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to glare at him. "You can't just decide that. People aren't possessions." Cassian tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You're not a possession. You're my mate. You just haven't accepted it yet." Sophia huffed, stepping back and holding the journal up like a shield. "Yeah, well, maybe you should focus on your therapy journal before you start throwing around words like mate." Cassian let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You never stop, do you?" Cassian reached out and gently took the journal from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. The warmth of his touch made her heart flutter, and she hated herself for it. "Go back to your room," he said softly. "It's late." Sophia hesitated, her eyes flicking to his. For a moment, she thought about saying something, anything, but instead she muttered, "Fine," and left the study. Back in her room, Sophia sat on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with everything she had read and everything Cassian had said. "Great," she muttered to herself. "Now I feel bad for the creepy vampire king. This is not how this was supposed to go." She rolled onto her side, clutching a pillow, but sleep wouldn't come. Meanwhile, Cassian remained in his study, staring down at the journal in his hands. His thoughts were consumed by Sophia, her defiance, her humor, her ability to see right through him. "You're not running from me, Sophia," he murmured to the empty room. "No matter how hard you try." Chapter 6. Cassian stood at the door to Sophia's room, his expression unreadable. "You'll be coming with me to the council meeting," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sophia, sprawled on the couch with a book she wasn't actually reading, sat up quickly. "I'm sorry, what now?" "You're coming," he repeated, stepping inside. "They need to see you to understand that you're not just a human. You're my mate." Her jaw dropped. "Wait, let me get this straight. You want me to meet your vampire buddies so they can all glare at me and silently judge your terrible taste in humans?" Cassian's lips twitched as if fighting a smile. "They'll see that you're mine. That's all that matters." Sophia rolled her eyes, throwing the book down. "Fine, but if one of them tries to bite me, I'm staking you first." He chuckled, but the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. "No one will touch you," he said, his tone firm and final. The council chamber was every bit as intimidating as Sophia had imagined. The grand, ancient hall loomed over her with its high ceilings, dark red tapestries, and a massive stone table that looked older than any building she'd ever seen. "Wow," she muttered under her breath as they stepped inside. "Love what they've done with the place. Real Vampires Anonymous vibes." Cassian shot her a look, but his lips twitched again. The council members were already seated, their gazes sharp and calculating. There was an air of quiet power about them, as if every one of them had seen centuries of battles and bloodshed. As Cassian guided her into the room with a firm hand on her back, all eyes turned to her. One older vampire sneered, his disdain clear. "You brought a human here?" Cassian ignored him and stepped forward, his presence commanding. "This is Sophia," he said, his voice steady. "My mate." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Sophia shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny, but held her head high, refusing to show weakness. Victor, the head of the council, leaned forward. "A human mate?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "That's a liability, Cassian. Humans are weak. They don't belong in our world." Sophia clenched her fists but stayed silent. Another vampire, a younger-looking one with a cruel smile, smirked and leaned back in his chair. "She doesn't look like much," he said. "Are you sure she's worth the trouble?" Sophia couldn't help herself. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say something? I couldn't hear you over all that ancient dust you're carrying around." Cassian's hand tightened slightly on her back, a silent warning. The vampire narrowed his eyes. "Feisty, isn't she? But humans are fragile. They break so easily." His gaze lingered on Sophia, and her stomach twisted with discomfort. Before she could respond, Cassian was across the room in the blink of an eye. His hand shot out, pinning the vampire against the wall by his throat. "Say one more word about her," Cassian growled, his voice low and menacing, "and it will be your last." The room fell into stunned silence. Cassian's fangs were bared, his eyes glowing with fury as he tightened his grip on the vampire's neck. Victor cleared his throat. "Cassian, this is unnecessary. Let him go." Cassian ignored him, his gaze locked on the vampire in his grip. "She's mine," he said, his voice deadly. "No one will touch her. No one will speak of her like that, and no one will question her place by my side." Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure whether to be terrified or flattered. "You know," she whispered under her breath, "growling like that isn't sexy." "Okay, maybe a little." Cassian's ears twitched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he finally released the vampire, who stumbled back, clutching his throat and glaring daggers at him. Cassian returned to Sophia's side, standing in front of her like a shield. His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "No one here will harm you. If they try, they answer to me." Sophia looked up at him, unsure how to feel. "You really need to work on your anger issues," she muttered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Cassian glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly. "You're worth losing control for." Victor, clearly trying to regain control of the meeting, addressed Cassian. "You've made your choice clear, but remember, if the girl proves to be a liability, it's on you." Cassian's gaze didn't waver. "She's not a liability. She's my strength." Victor gave him a pointed look, but said nothing more. Cassian took Sophia's hand and led her out of the chamber, his grip firm but not painful. She glanced at him as they walked down the hall. "You know, I could have handled that," she said finally. Cassian smirked. "I know, but I'll never let you fight alone." Back in her room, Sophia flopped onto the bed, her mind spinning. She was angry at Cassian for being so overbearing, but a tiny part of her couldn't shake the way he had defended her so fiercely. "Why does he have to be like that?" she muttered. "Possessive, broody, and kind of hot when he's angry." Meanwhile, in his private quarters, Cassian stared out at the dark horizon, his fists clenched. He knew the council would continue to doubt him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was keeping Sophia safe. "No one will take her from me," he murmured to himself. "No one." Chapter 7. Sophia stretched as the morning sunlight filtered through her window. For once, everything felt calm. No growling Cassian, no vampires staring at her like she didn't belong, and no escape plans to plot. She curled up in the chair by the window, watching the sunrise. It was peaceful, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way Cassian had been acting lately, so protective and intense. Not that he wasn't always like that, but recently it seemed worse. She was just starting to enjoy the quiet when the door burst open. Cassian stood there, his eyes blazing and jaw tight. "Stay close to me today," he said, his tone sharp. Sophia blinked, startled. "What? Why? Is this another one of your overprotective episodes?" "There's been an attack," Cassian said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. His voice was calm, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. "A rival clan knows you're here." Sophia's stomach flipped. "What do you mean they know I'm here? What do they want?" Cassian's expression darkened. "They want you. Now, do as I say and don't argue." Cassian led Sophia to the grand hall, where several guards stood at attention. The air felt heavy, and Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. "What's going on?" she whispered as Cassian placed her in the center of the room. Before he could answer, the sound of shouting and clashing steel echoed through the castle. Sophia froze. It wasn't just noise, it was a battle. Cassian turned to the guards. "Hold the line. No one gets through," he commanded. "What's happening?" Sophia asked again, her voice shaky. "Stay here," Cassian said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, don't leave this room." Before Sophia could argue, the doors to the hall burst open. A group of vampires stormed in, their leader, a tall, smirking man, stepping forward. Cassian immediately moved to shield Sophia, his body tense and ready to strike. The leader sneered. "Cassian, harboring a human? You're slipping." "Victor," Cassian growled, "turn around and leave. You're not welcome here." Victor ignored him, his gaze shifting to Sophia. "So, this is her? The little human everyone's talking about?" Sophia frowned. "Little? I'm not little." Victor chuckled. "Feisty, aren't you? Just like her father." Her heart stopped. "My father?" Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, she doesn't know? This is Rich." He turned to Cassian. "Did you tell her? Did you tell her who she really is?" Cassian didn't move, his jaw tightening. "What is he talking about?" Sophia asked, looking between them. Victor laughed. "Your father is one of the greatest vampire hunters to ever live. His hands are soaked in the blood of my kind. And Cassian's, dozens of us, slaughtered without mercy." "That's not true," Sophia said, shaking her head. "My father's late. He's not alive." "A little girl," Victor sneered. "Your father's bloodline is steeped in ours. Ask your precious mate how many of his own fell to your family's blades." Sophia's knees felt weak. She turned to Cassian, but he didn't deny it. Before she could process anything, Victor lunged toward her. Cassian moved faster, stepping in front of her and blocking Victor's attack. "She's under my protection," Cassian snarled, shoving Victor back. "You'll have to go through me." The fight erupted. Cassian was a blur, taking on multiple attackers at once. His movements were precise and deadly, but the sheer number of enemies overwhelmed even him. Sophia pressed herself against the wall, watching in horror as Cassian fought. "Cassian, stop!" she shouted, but he didn't listen. One of the vampires broke through the chaos and charged at her. Sophia stumbled back, her heart racing, but before the vampire could reach her, Cassian appeared. He struck the vampire down with brutal efficiency, his fangs bared and eyes glowing. "Stay back," he growled at Sophia, his voice rough. "I'm not letting them touch you." Victor lunged again, his blade slicing across Cassian's chest. Sophia screamed as Cassian staggered, blood staining his shirt, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Victor by the throat and slammed him into the ground, delivering a final blow. Victor's body stilled, and the remaining attackers fled. When the room finally fell silent, Sophia rushed to Cassian's side. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. Cassian ignored his wounds, his focus entirely on her. He knelt before her, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice rough but soft. Sophia shook her head. "No, I'm fine, but you're—" "I don't care about me," Cassian interrupted, pulling her into his arms. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You're mine, Sophia, and I'll destroy anyone who tries to take you from me." Her breath hitched as she leaned into him, too shaken to pull away. "You're lucky I'm too tired to argue about the whole mine thing," she muttered weakly. Cassian carried her back to her room, his steps steady despite the blood dripping from his wounds. Sophia tried to protest, but he silenced her with a look. "Let me take care of you," he said softly. He set her down on the bed and began cleaning his injuries, wincing slightly as he worked. Sophia watched him, guilt and confusion swirling in her chest. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. "Why risk everything for me?" Cassian looked up, his gaze steady. "Because you're everything to me." Sophia didn't know how to respond. Her heart ached, and her head spun with too many questions. Later that night, alone in her room, Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The revelation about her father haunted her. Could it really be true? And if it was, what did that make her? But more than anything, she couldn't stop thinking about Cassian, his protectiveness, his strength, and the way he looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. "Why does he have to be like that?" she whispered. "Possessive, broody, and kind of hot when he's angry." Meanwhile, in his private quarters, Cassian stood by the window, staring out into the night. Despite his injuries, he couldn't stop thinking about Sophia, her defiance, her fire, and the fear he saw in her eyes when Victor revealed the truth. "No one will take her from me," he murmured to himself. "No one." Chapter 8. Sophia couldn't sleep. The room was too quiet, but her mind wasn't. Victor's words wouldn't stop replaying in her head. "Your father's blood is steeped in ours." Her father? A vampire hunter? It didn't make sense. She sat up in bed, clutching the blanket tightly. No, this had to be a mistake. Her parents were just normal wolves, regular alphas, good people. They couldn't have been killers. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, swinging her legs off the bed. "There's no way that's true." But deep down, doubt crept in, and she needed answers. Sophia stormed into Cassian's study early the next morning. He stood by the window, his hands behind his back, staring out at the horizon. He didn't turn around when she entered, but she knew he was aware of her presence. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking. Cassian finally turned to face her, his expression calm, but guarded. "Sophia." "Don't Sophia me," she snapped, stepping closer. "You knew what Victor was talking about, didn't you? About my parents. Tell me the truth, Cassian." He sighed, his shoulders tensing. "It's not a story you want to hear." She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at him. "I don't care. I deserve to know what really happened to my parents." Cassian hesitated, his jaw tightening. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "Your parents were vampire hunters," he said finally, his voice low. "Not just hunters. They were some of the best." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "They spent their lives tracking and killing vampires," Cassian continued. "They believed it was their duty to protect their kind, no matter the cost." Sophia shook her head, taking a step back. "No, that's not true. My parents wouldn't." "They did," Cassian interrupted, his tone heavy with regret. "They came for me, Sophia. They wanted to kill me." Her heart sank, and he hesitated again, his gaze dropping. "And I killed them. It was self-defense." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment, all she could do was stare at him, her mind spinning. "You killed them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cassian looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't have a choice. If I hadn't fought back, they would have killed me." Sophia's legs felt weak, and she stumbled back until she found a chair. She sat down hard, burying her face in her hands. "This can't be true," she mumbled. "It can't. I wish it wasn't," Cassian said softly. But it is. Sophia's head snapped up, tears streaming down her face. You're lying. My parents wouldn't do that. They weren't murderers. Cassian's expression didn't change. They thought they were protecting their kind. They believed what they were doing was right. But you killed them, she shouted, her voice breaking. You took them away from me. I know, Cassian said quietly, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. Her anger turned into heartbreak as she looked away, her shoulders trembling. All this time, I thought they were good people, heroes, and now you're telling me they were killers? And you, her voice cracked, you're the one who took them from me. Cassian moved closer, kneeling in front of her. Sophia, I didn't want to kill them, but I didn't have a choice. They left me no choice. Sophia stared at him, her vision blurred by tears. You expect me to forgive you for that? Cassian's voice trembled as he spoke. I don't expect anything, Sophia, but I need you to know the truth. I would rather die than lose you. If I could undo it, I would, but I can't. All I can do now is protect you. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping her tears. Great, so you're the tragic villain in my life story. Couldn't I have been kidnapped by a nice vampire with a puppy or something? Cassian let out a quiet, humorless laugh, his lips twitching into the faintest smile. I'd trade my crown for a puppy if it meant you'd forgive me. Sophia shook her head, pulling away from him. Forgive you? You killed my parents, Cassian. How am I supposed to forgive that? I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw. But I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust. Whatever it takes. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I can't deal with this right now. I can't. Sophia. She cut him off, her voice firm. Don't. Just don't. Without another word. She turned and stormed out of the study, leaving Cassian kneeling on the floor. Back in her room, Sophia paced restlessly. Her mind raced with everything Cassian had told her. The parents she had idolized, the ones she had believed were heroes, were nothing like she thought. And the man she was slowly beginning to trust had been the one to take them away. Why does he have to be so complicated? She muttered to herself. Couldn't he just be a regular vampire king without all the tragic baggage? She flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached and her head spun, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about Cassian's words, or the pain in his eyes when he said them. Meanwhile, in his study, Cassian sat on the floor, staring at the spot where Sophia had stood. His fists clenched as he replayed the conversation in his mind. I'll prove myself to you, Sophia, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. No matter how long it takes. His resolve hardened. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to show her that his love for her was real and that she was more important to him than anything else. Chapter 9. Sophia paced her room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about Cassian, about everything he'd done, and everything he meant to her now. The confusion and frustration tangled in her chest felt like a constant knot. Before she could sort out her thoughts, the door burst open. Elias, Cassian's loyal servant, rushed in, his face pale and serious. Sophia, he said urgently, Cassian's been taken. She froze. What? Taken? By who? The rival clan. Elias said, catching his breath. They ambushed him outside the castle. They've chained him with enchanted silver and dragged him to their fortress. Sophia's heart sank. But he's Cassian. He's supposed to be unstoppable. How could they? They caught him off guard. Elias interrupted. If we don't act soon, they'll kill him. The weight of his words hit her like a punch. Her anger at Cassian, her lingering doubts, they all melted away. Then we'll go get him, she said firmly. Elias frowned. Yes, we, Sophia snapped. I'm not just sitting here while they kill him. Now, are you going to help me or not? Elias hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but you'll follow my lead. In Cassian's study, Elias spread out a map of the rival clan's fortress. It was massive and heavily guarded, but one small passage at the back caught Sophia's eye. What about this? She asked, pointing to it. Elias squinted. It's narrow, but it could work. You're small enough to squeeze through. Sophia shot him a look. Gee, thanks. It's risky, Elias warned. So is doing nothing, Sophia retorted, her tone sharp. Elias sighed, clearly regretting involving her. Fine, we'll use the passage, but you'll need to blend in. Can you handle that? Sophia grabbed a plain cloak from a nearby chair and tossed it over her shoulders. How do I look? Like you're going to get us both killed, Elias muttered. The fortress loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding under the night sky. Sophia followed Elias as they crept toward the hidden passage, her heart pounding in her chest. Why do vampire lairs always have to be so creepy? She whispered. What's wrong with a nice, bright castle? Elias ignored her, motioning for her to stay quiet as they slipped inside. Inside, the halls were dimly lit and eerily quiet. Sophia pulled the hood of her cloak lower over her face, clutching a tray of goblets she'd grabbed to complete her disguise. As she walked, a guard stopped her. Who are you? Thinking quickly, Sophia straightened her back and snapped. I'm new. Do you want your drink or not? The guard grumbled something under his breath, but waved her along. She let out a quiet sigh of relief. Following Elias's directions, she made her way to the dungeons. When she finally reached the cell, her breath caught. Cassian was chained to the wall, his shirt torn and his body battered. Blood stained his skin, but his eyes still glowed faintly with defiance. Cassian, she whispered, her voice trembling. His head snapped up, and for a moment he looked confused. Sophia, he rasped, what are you doing here? Saving your stubborn, broody self, she muttered, pulling a pin from her cloak. She knelt by the chains, her hands shaking as she worked to unlock them. You're lucky I didn't leave you here after everything you've put me through, she said, her voice tight. Cassian managed a weak smirk. You wouldn't. Shut up, she snapped, finally breaking one of the locks. When the last chain fell away, Cassian slumped forward. Sophia caught him, her arms wrapping around his broad shoulders. He felt heavier than she expected, and the warmth of his body made her chest tighten. I don't want to lose you, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Even if you are an infuriating bloodsucker. Cassian raised a hand to her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. You came for me, he said, his voice raw. Of course I did, she said, blinking back tears. You're important. Cassian didn't reply. Instead, he leaned forward, his lips brushing against hers in a desperate, heated kiss. Sophia froze for a second, then melted into the kiss, her hands clutching his torn shirt. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. When they finally broke apart, Sophia's cheeks were flushed. If this is what it takes to shut you up, she muttered, I might actually survive whatever it is we're doing. Cassian let out a low laugh, his forehead resting against hers. You're incredible. Their escape wasn't easy. Alarms blared as guards realized something was wrong. Sophia and Elias supported Cassian as they made their way through the halls, ducking behind corners to avoid detection. At one point, a group of guards caught up to them. Elias took them out with swift, precise movements, his blade flashing in the dim light. Sophia stared, wide-eyed. Remind me never to mess with you, she whispered. Elias smirked but didn't reply. When another guard lunged toward them, Sophia grabbed a nearby tray and smacked him over the head. The guard crumpled to the ground, and Sophia grinned. Not bad for a human. Huh, she said, glancing at Cassian. Cassian, leaning heavily on her, gave her a proud look. Not bad at all. They finally made it back to Cassian's castle, just as dawn began to break. Servants rushed to tend to Cassian's injuries, but Sophia refused to leave his side, brushing off her own exhaustion. As the healers finished their work, Cassian pulled her aside, his expression soft. "You risked everything for me," he said quietly. "Why?" Sophia looked away, shrugging. "Because I couldn't just let them have you." Cassian reached for her hand, his gaze intense. "You mean more to me than I can put into words, Sophia. And I'll spend every day proving that to you." Sophia didn't respond, but her hand lingered in his for a moment longer than necessary before she pulled away. Chapter 10. Sophia blinked awake, the morning sunlight spilling through the curtains. For once she didn't feel a jolt of panic or fear. Instead, there was a strange calm, like the storm of the past few days had settled. But her mind wasn't quiet. She lay still, staring at the ceiling. Memories of Cassian, his fierce protectiveness, his vulnerability, and of course, that kiss, played over and over in her head. It left a confusing mix of feelings in her chest. Sighing, she sat up and wandered to the window, pulling her knees to her chest. "What am I even doing here?" she whispered to herself. "Am I crazy for staying?" The idea of leaving crossed her mind, but deep down it felt wrong. No matter how angry she was, no matter how much Cassian frustrated her, the thought of walking away didn't sit right. Cassian had been keeping his distance since they returned to the mansion. Sophia could feel him watching her sometimes, but he never approached or pressed her to talk. In the grand hall, Elias stood beside him, observing his quiet restraint. "You're letting her make the first move?" Elias asked, surprised. "That's not like you." Cassian gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "She deserves to choose. I won't force her to stay. Not this time." Elias raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "I hope you know what you're doing." Cassian's gaze turned toward the hallway leading to Sophia's room. "So do I." Sophia had been pacing her room for hours when she finally made up her mind. Enough overthinking. If Cassian wasn't going to come to her, then she'd go to him. She marched down to his study, determination in every step. When she pushed open the door, she found him sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and maps. He looked up, and for a moment his expression softened, like seeing her was the best part of his day. "All right, Broody King," she began, crossing her arms. "Let's get one thing straight. If I'm staying here, it's on my terms." Cassian leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Your terms?" Sophia took a deep breath and started listing her rules. "First, no more of this you're mine nonsense unless I say so. Second, I'm not some prisoner or possession. If I want to go for a walk, I'm going for a walk." Cassian rested his elbows on the desk, listening patiently. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes stayed locked on her. When she finished, she waited for him to argue, to push back. But instead, he stood slowly and walked toward her. Stopping just a step away, he said softly, "I'll give you as much freedom as you want, as long as you stay by my side." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Is that another one of your possessive lines? Or are you actually being reasonable for once?" Cassian's lips twitched. "Both." His tone threw her off balance, but it was his next move that really got to her. He reached for her hand, holding it gently as he said, "Sophia, I'll spend eternity proving my love to you, even if it takes that long for you to believe me." The sincerity in his voice left her speechless for a moment. She swallowed hard, feeling her resolve waver. But then, to keep herself from getting too caught up, she smirked. "Eternity? Fine," she said. "But you're doing the dishes for the first 100 years. Cassian chuckled, the sound soft and warm. "If that's what it takes, I'll do it." Feeling the tension ease, Sophia leaned against the desk and crossed her arms. "So, does this make you my eternal husband now?" Cassian tilted his head, clearly amused. "If that's what you want to call it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a teasing whisper. "But don't forget, you'll be my eternal wife. I wonder which of us will regret it first. Sophia laughed, lightly shoving him away. Careful, or I'll make you sleep in the dungeon. Cassian smiled, his eyes soft with something that looked a lot like affection. I think I'd survive. For a moment, the two of them stood there, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. Cassian reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered, and Sophia's breath hitched. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly stepped back, clearing her throat. I'll stay, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. But don't think this means I've forgiven you. For everything. Cassian nodded, his expression serious. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'll wait, for as long as it takes. Back in her room, Sophia sat by the window, her knees pulled up to her chest again. But this time, she felt lighter. Watching the sunset, she muttered to herself, guess I'm stuck with him now. In his study, Cassian stood by the same window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His thoughts were filled with her fire, her wit, and the way she looked at him like he was more than just a monster. I'll never let you regret staying, Sophia, he whispered to himself. Never. The end.